In 1875, workers digging along the bank of the Ohio River found some bones they didn't recognize. They were big, bigger than any dog or wolf they'd seen, but otherwise unremarkable. So the bones sat around for a while before they eventually made their way to a scientist named Joseph Leidy in Philadelphia. Leidy looked at them carefully. He compared them to every wolf species known at the time. And what he concluded was that these belonged to something that no longer existed. A wolf, yes, but one significantly larger and more heavily built than anything alive today. He named it Canis dirus. In Latin, that roughly means the fearsome dog. It was a reasonable name, but for a long time, almost no one outside of paleontology paid much attention to it. That changed slowly as more fossils turned up. And eventually, one site in particular changed everything we knew about this animal. Beneath what is now the Hancock Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, crude oil has been seeping up through the ground for tens of thousands of years. When it pools at the surface, it forms tar, a sticky, dark substance that looks harmless enough from a distance, but can trap an animal that steps into it. Over millennia, animals did exactly that. They got stuck, and other animals came to investigate, and they got stuck too. Layer by layer, the tar preserved what fell into it. Scientists began seriously excavating the Brea Tar Pits in the early 20th century, and what they found there was remarkable. Over 4,000 individual dire wolf specimens have been recovered from that one site alone. That's more than any other large predator found there, more than saber-toothed cats, more than giant ground sloths, more than American lions. What that number tells us is that the dire wolf was not a rare animal. It was common across prehistoric North America, and apparently bold enough, or hungry enough, to keep approaching the tar pits even as others of its kind got trapped there. The fossils from La Brea are also unusually well preserved. Well preserved enough that scientists can study individual animals in some detail. They found healed fractures, broken bones that mended over time, meaning the animal survived whatever caused the break and kept living for months or years afterward. They found worn teeth from years of heavy use. They found joint damage consistent with old age. Some of these animals had injuries serious enough that they couldn't have hunted effectively on their own. The fact that they survived suggests that other members of the pack were feeding them. The dire wolf, based on this evidence, appears to have been a highly social animal, one that maintained bonds within the group and, at least sometimes, looked after injured members. So what did this animal actually look like? The skeleton gives us a lot to work with. The dire wolf stood about 2.5 feet at the shoulder, similar in height to a large modern wolf, but noticeably heavier in build. Adults weighed somewhere between 130 and 150 pounds on average. The skull was wider and more robust than a gray wolf's, and the teeth, particularly the molars, were proportionally larger and built for crushing, bone crushing specifically. Analysis of wear patterns on the teeth suggests the dire wolf was doing this regularly, working through carcasses far more thoroughly than modern wolves typically do. The body plan overall suggests an animal optimized for strength rather than speed. It could move efficiently across open terrain and through forests, but it wasn't built for long, fast chases. It relied on endurance, on working with other pack members, and on reading the landscape well enough to cut off prey rather than outrun it. For a long time, early reconstructions showed it as basically a stockier gray wolf. And that's not entirely wrong. But modern paleoartists, scientists who specialize in reconstructing extinct animals, have refined that picture considerably, using the detailed measurements from La Brea and comparative anatomy from living canids to produce much more precise illustrations. Digital tools and CGI have pushed this further, and what we have now is a much clearer sense of what a living dire wolf actually looked like. In terms of diet, the evidence points to large herbivores. Ancient horses, bison, camels, and ground sloths were all likely prey. Yes, camels. North America had several camel species during the Ice Age, and the dire wolf would have encountered them regularly. The heavy-duty teeth and jaws suggest it wasn't just killing these animals, but processing them completely, which may indicate that food was sometimes scarce and nothing could be wasted. or simply that this was the most efficient feeding strategy available to a pack-hunting animal of its size. The dire wolf wasn't the only large predator in its world. It shared the landscape with saber-toothed cats, Smilodon, and with the American lion, which was larger than any lion alive today. How these species interacted is still debated, but the evidence from La Brea suggests they were in direct competition for many of the same prey animals. The large number of dire wolf specimens compared to other predators suggests it was the most numerically dominant of them, but that doesn't mean the relationships were simple. It also shared its range for a significant period with another wolf, the ancestor of today's gray wolf, which had migrated into North America from Eurasia. For thousands of years, both species lived on the same continent in overlapping territory. And here's something that genuinely surprised researchers when they looked at it more carefully. They never interbred. Genetic analysis published in 2021 confirmed that the dire wolf's lineage had diverged from other wolf ancestors over 5 million years ago, far earlier than scientists had assumed. Despite living alongside gray wolf ancestors for a long period, the two species maintained a complete genetic separation. The reasons aren't fully understood. Differences in behavior, in breeding timing, or in the specific habitats each preferred likely kept them apart. But the result is that the dire wolf, despite looking somewhat similar to a large gray wolf, was actually quite a distant relative, its own distinct branch of the canid family that evolved separately for millions of years. That distinction matters quite a bit for what's happening right now. In 2025, a biotechnology company called Colossal Biosciences announced that they were working toward bringing back the dire wolf. The approach involves extracting ancient DNA from well-preserved specimens and using that genetic information, along with CRISPR gene editing technology, to modify the genome of a living gray wolf towards something closer to the dire wolf's biology. The goal isn't a perfect genetic replica. That's not currently possible, and may not be possible in any strict sense. What Colossal is working toward is an animal that expresses the key physical traits of the dire wolf: the body size, the skull and jaw structure, the proportions. Something that would function ecologically in a similar role. The scientific response has been measured. Some researchers are genuinely enthusiastic about what the project could reveal, both about de-extinction as a concept and about the dire wolf's biology specifically. Others are more cautious. A genome is not a complete biological blueprint. Microbiome, learned behavior, the accumulated physiological adaptations of millions of years. None of that can be fully reconstructed from DNA sequences alone. What you'd end up with, critics argue, is an approximation. An animal inspired by the dire wolf rather than the dire wolf itself. There's also the practical question of what you do with such an animal. The dire wolf's ecological role, keeping large herbivore populations in check, shaping the movement and behavior of prey species across vast landscapes, disappeared with it nearly 10,000 years ago. The ecosystems it once moved through have reorganized completely in its absence. Reintroducing something like it would have consequences that are genuinely difficult to predict. That said, the Yellowstone wolf reintroduction in 1995 gives scientists a useful reference point. When gray wolves were brought back to Yellowstone after a 70-year absence, the effects on the ecosystem were broader than most people expected. Elk behavior changed, vegetation recovered in certain areas, river dynamics shifted. The return of a single predator species reshaped the park in measurable ways. Whether that's an argument for or against dire wolf de-extinction depends on who you ask, and what you think the goal of conservation actually is. The dire wolf disappeared at the end of the last ice age, roughly 9,000 to 10,000 years ago, alongside most of the other large mammals that had dominated the Pleistocene. Woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, American horses, the short-faced bear. All of them vanished within a few thousand years of each other. What caused it is still debated. The climate was changing, the ice age was ending, and the habitats these animals depended on were shrinking or shifting. Human populations were also moving through the Americas for the first time, and hunting pressure on the large herbivores that predators like the dire wolf depended on would have compounded whatever the climate was already doing. The dire wolf's specialization may have worked against it here. Unlike the gray wolf, which was adaptable enough to follow the changing world, the dire wolf appears to have been closely tied to the megafauna of the Pleistocene. When those animals declined, so did the dire wolf. Not quickly, but steadily, until there was nothing left. Its disappearance left a gap in the ecosystem. Large-bodied pack hunters that could bring down bison and ground sloths were no longer part of the North American landscape. How that absence shaped what came after, the prey species that survived, the vegetation that grew where herds no longer moved in the same patterns, is something ecologists are still working through. There's one more thing worth mentioning because it comes up every time this animal is discussed. Game of Thrones made the dire wolf, spelled as one word in the show, famous to an audience of hundreds of millions of people. The Stark family's wolves were fictional, larger than the real animal, and given abilities that no actual wolf possesses. But the show introduced a generation of viewers to the idea that something like this had actually existed, and interest in the real prehistoric animal spiked noticeably each time a new season aired. The real direwolf was not a fantasy creature. It didn't have the mythological scale of the show's version, but in some ways, the actual biology is more interesting. An animal that evolved over millions of years into one of the most effective pack hunters the continent had ever seen, that left behind an extraordinary fossil record, and that disappeared not because it failed, but because the world it was built for stopped existing. That's the direwolf. And depending on what happens in the next few years in certain genetics laboratories, it may not be a purely historical story for much longer. If you have thoughts on the de-extinction question, whether it's something worth pursuing, or whether there are better uses of that science, leave them in the comments. It's a genuinely open debate, and the people working on it are paying attention to public opinion more than you might expect. If you found this interesting, subscribe for more videos on the animals that shaped the prehistoric world. There's a lot left to cover.